The origin and justification of private property was one of the great controversies of the 17th century. Many participants in this controversy believed private property gradually emerged from a primitive communism, which had existed during the early ages of mankind. And, although modern historians reject this simplistic account, it was central to the 17th century debate. Most 17th century philosophers, including Locke, were familiar with the theories of the Dutch philosopher Hugo Grotius. Grotius claims that common ownership preceded private ownership. But as societies advanced to higher levels of civilization, common ownership proved inadequate, so men agreed to institute private property instead. To quote Grotius,
"Men were not content to feed on the spontaneous products of the earth, to dwell in caves, to have the body either naked or clothed with the bark of trees or skins of wild animals, but chose a more refined mode of life. This gave rise to industry, which some applied to one thing, others to another."
Assuming this is accurate history, we may still ask, was the transition from common ownership to private ownership morally defensible? Yes, answers Grotius. Private property emerged from the unanimous consent of mankind.
Private ownership happened by a kind of agreement, either express or implied. In fact, as soon as community ownership was abandoned, and as yet no division had been made, it is to be supposed that all agreed that whatever each one had taken possession of should be his property.
Sir Robert Filmer penned a devastating critique of this argument.
"Certainly it was a rare felicity that all the men in the world at one instant of time should agree together in one mind to change the natural community of things into private dominion. For without such a unanimous consent, it was not possible for community to be altered. For, if but one man in the world had dissented, the alteration had been unjust, because that man, by the law of nature, had a right to the common use of all things in the world, so that to have given a propriety of any one thing to any other had been to have robbed him of his right to the common use of all things."
Filmer hit the nail on the head. It is absurd to believe every person in the world agreed to private property. Therefore, if we assume common ownership was the original condition of mankind, private property is nothing less than flagrant theft on a gigantic scale. How, then, can the transition from common ownership to private ownership be justified? A solution to this puzzle was suggested by the German philosopher Samuel Pufendorf in his book The Law of Nature and Nations. Published in 1672, this massive work achieved international fame and was admired by John Locke, who called it the best book of its kind. According to Pufendorf, the phrase community of all things should be understood in a negative sense.
Before any conventions of men existed, there was a community of all things, not indeed such as we have called positive, but a negative one. That is, that all things lay open to all men, and belonged no more to one than to another.
In effect, Pufendorf rejects common ownership altogether. By an original community of all things, he means that natural resources were originally unowned, and that all men possessed equal rights to appropriate these unowned resources for their private use. In this interpretation, private property was not a kind of theft committed against communal property, because, strictly speaking, no one really owned natural resources before they became private property. Does John Locke agree with Pufendorf on this issue? When Locke speaks of common dominion, does he mean unowned resources to which all men have equal claim? Some commentators interpret Locke this way. Other commentators disagree. Unfortunately, Locke's notion of common dominion is so vague and ill-defined that the scholarly dispute over his intended meaning will probably continue indefinitely. Locke is clear about one thing, however. Private property is a natural right grounded in the natural law of self-preservation. Contrary to Grotius, Pufendorf, and others, Locke does not regard private property as a social convention arising from the consent of mankind. Indeed, in a passage we quoted earlier, Locke says he is going to justify private property without relying on consent.
I shall endeavour to show how men might come to have a property in several parts of that which God gave to mankind in common, and that without any express compact of all the commoners.
Locke opens his defense of private property with a crucial observation. If natural resources are to benefit mankind, there must be some way to appropriate these resources for private use.
God, who hath given the world to men in common, hath also given them reason to make use of it to the best advantage of life and convenience. The earth and all that is therein is given to men for the support and comfort of their being. And though all the fruits it naturally produces and beasts it feeds belong to mankind in common, as they are produced by the spontaneous hand of nature, and no body has originally a private dominion, exclusive of the rest of mankind, in any of them, as they are thus in their natural state, yet, being given for the use of men, there must of necessity be a means to appropriate them some way or other before they can be of any use, or at all beneficial to any particular man.
Locke believes the earth and its resources were given to men in common. But this is not true of human beings. A person is not part of a common stock. A person is a rational moral agent who is responsible for his actions. A person is a self-owner.
Though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself.
Does this conflict with Locke's earlier claim that God owns human beings? No. Earlier, Locke was speaking of the moral relationship between God and man. Now he is speaking of the moral relationship between man and man. In addition, Locke says man has a property in his own person. He doesn't say man has an absolute property in his own person. Locke defends self-ownership, but in a qualified form. He rejects the right to commit suicide, for example, because this violates divine law. Only God, says Locke, can own a man absolutely. Locke did not originate the principle of self-ownership, or property in one's person. Several decades before Locke wrote Two Treatises of Government, self-ownership had been defended by a group of radical individualists known as levelers. For example, in 1646, a leveler leader named Richard Overton was imprisoned by the House of Lords. In typical leveler fashion, Overton responded by writing a pamphlet with a fiery title, "An Arrow Against All Tyrants and Tyranny, shot from the prison of Newgate into the prerogative bowels of the arbitrary House of Lords and all other usurpers and tyrants whatsoever." In this pamphlet, Overton defends self-ownership.
To every individual in nature is given an individual property by nature, not to be invaded or usurped by any. For everyone, as he is himself, so he hath a self-propriety, else could he not be himself. And on this no second may presume to deprive any of, without manifest violation and affront to the very principles of nature, and of the rules of equity and justice between man and man. Mine and thine cannot be, except this be: no man hath power over my rights and liberties, and I over no man's. By natural birth all men are equally and alike born to the like propriety, liberty, and freedom, and as we are delivered of God by the hand of nature into this world, every one with a natural, innate freedom and propriety, as it were writ in the table of every man's heart, never to be obliterated, even so are we to live, every one, equally and alike, to enjoy his birthright and privilege, even all whereof God by nature hath made him free.
These principles were repeated by other levelers during the 1640s. Did John Locke read any of their copious pamphlets? We don't know, but the similarities between Locke and the Levelers are unmistakable. Beginning with self-ownership, Locke develops an ingenious defense of private property. Just as we own our bodies, Locke says, so we own our labor. And when we use this labor to appropriate resources, we remove those resources from the common stock and acquire property rights in them.
The labor of a man's body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with, and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature placed it in, hath by this labor something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men. For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that is once joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others.
Human labor creates property in external goods. Locke illustrates this principle with an example.
He that is nourished by the acorns he picked up under an oak, or the apples he gathered from the trees in the woods, has certainly appropriated them to himself. Nobody can deny but the nourishment is his. I ask then, when did they begin to be his? When he digested? Or when he eat? Or when he boiled? Or when he brought them home? Or when he picked them up? And 'tis plain, if the first gathering made them not his, nothing else could. That labor put a distinction between them and common. That added something to them more than nature, the common mother of all, had done. And so they became his private right.
When a man gathers acorns in the wild, he mixes his labor with the acorns, and thereby becomes their owner. This acquisition of property, Locke emphasizes, doesn't require the consent of other people.
Will anyone say he had no right to those acorns or apples he thus appropriated, because he had not the consent of all mankind to make them his? Was it a robbery thus to assume to himself what belonged to all in common? If such a consent as that was necessary, man had starved, notwithstanding the plenty God had given him.
Hence, private property doesn't depend on the approval or consent of others, including government. Private property is not a social convention. It is a natural right required for human survival.
The condition of human life, which requires labor and materials to work on, necessarily introduces private possessions.
In developing his case for private ownership, Locke inserts a limitation. God has provided the earth and its resources for all men to enjoy. Therefore, no person may deprive others by amassing more property than he can use for himself, for his family, or for barter. When Locke applies this limitation to food and other perishable goods, he reaches this conclusion.
As much as anyone can make use of to any advantage of life before it spoils, so much he may, by his labor, fix a property in. Whatever is beyond this is more than his share and belongs to others. Nothing was made by God for man to spoil or destroy.
Locke believes this spoilage limitation was of little consequence in the early ages of mankind, because the earth produced more than enough to feed a sparsely populated world. As the population increased, however, and as people settled in dense communities, some people might have tried to hoard more perishables than they could use. Fortunately, serious conflict was avoided when gold and silver came to be used as money, a medium of exchange. Gold and silver are imperishable. They neither spoil nor decay. Thus, when men agreed to use precious metals as a medium of exchange, it became possible to amass unlimited wealth without violating the spoilage limitation.
He that gathered 100 bushels of acorns or apples had thereby a property in them. They were his goods as soon as gathered. He was only to look that he used them before they spoiled, else he took more than his share and robbed others. If he gave away a part to anybody else, so that it perished not uselessly in his possession, these he also made use of. And if he also bartered away plums that would have rotted in a week for nuts that would last good for his eating a whole year, he did no injury. He wasted not the common stock, destroyed no part of the portion of goods that belonged to others, so long as nothing perished uselessly in his hands. Again, if he would give us nuts for a piece of metal, pleased with its colour, or exchanged his sheep for shells, or wool for a sparkling pebble or diamond, and keep those by him all his life, he invaded not the right of others. He might heap up as much of these durable things as he pleased, the exceeding of the bounds of his just property not lying in the largeness of his possession, but the perishing of anything uselessly in it.
Is it just, we may ask, for one man to be richer than his neighbors? Yes, answers Locke, if the rich man acquired his property without force or fraud. After all, gold and silver are of little practical use. The rich man cannot use them for food, clothing, shelter, or transportation. The man who possesses gold and silver is rich only if other people agree to accept these metals in exchange for consumable goods. Gold and silver derive their value from the consent manifested in voluntary exchange. Therefore, the rich man, merely by being rich, does not deprive others of the necessities of life. As Locke says,
"Since gold and silver, being little useful to the life of man in proportion to food, raiment, and carriage, has its value only from the consent of men, it is plain that men have agreed to disproportionate and unequal possession of the earth, they having, by a tacit and voluntary consent, found out a way how a man may fairly possess more land than he himself can use the product of, by receiving in exchange for the overplus gold and silver, which may be hoarded up without injury to anyone, these metals not spoiling or decaying in the hands of the possessor. This partage of things, in an inequality of private possessions, men have made practicable out of the bounds of society, and without compact, only by putting a value on gold and silver, and tacitly agreeing in the use of money."
Does this mean a rich man can stand idly by while a poor man starves? No, says Locke. The starving man has a right to charity.
"We know God hath not left one man to the mercy of another, that he may starve him if he please. God, the Lord and Father of all, has given no one of his children such a property in his peculiar portion of the things of this world, but that he has given his needy brother a right to the surplusage of his goods, so that it cannot justly be denied him when his pressing wants call for it."
After establishing private property as a natural right, Locke returns to a basic theme of the second treatise. Men submit voluntarily to government in order to secure peace and protect their property.
Men being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living one amongst another, in a secure enjoyment of their properties, and a greater security against any that are not of it.
For Locke, a government is established in two stages. First, a number of people unanimously agree to leave the state of nature and form a political society. This is the social contract. Second, the majority of people in a political society decides on its form of government. This principle of majority rule is extremely important, for without it, a society could not act as one body.
And thus, every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to everyone of that society to submit to the determination of the majority, and to be concluded by it. Or else, this original compact, whereby he with others incorporates into one society, would signify nothing, and be no compact, if he be left free and under no other ties than he was in before in the state of nature.
According to Locke, the majority may establish a perfect democracy, an oligarchy, an hereditary monarchy, an elective monarchy, or a mixture of these. Whatever its form, a government must rest on consent.
This is that, and that only, which did or could give beginning to any lawful government in the world.
A government is legitimate only if it is established by the consent of the people. But did any governments actually begin like this? Was there ever a state of nature? And if so, do we possess historical evidence that men voluntarily abandoned the state of nature to form political societies ruled by governments? Yes, says Locke, the state of nature did exist, and some governments were established by the consent of the governed. Here, Locke treads on thin ice. His historical argument is widely criticized as one of the weakest parts of the second treatise. Locke concedes the lack of historical evidence for a state of nature, but written records did not appear until after governments were established. This, Locke says, is why we don't find historical accounts of the state of nature. Locke also concedes that some governments were forcibly imposed through conquest, but he believes other governments were established by consent, and he offers the questionable examples of Sparta, Rome, and Venice. Most 17th century philosophers believed monarchies had evolved from the father's authority over his family. This was the ancient theory of Aristotle, a revered political sage, and Aristotle was used by Sir Robert Filmer to support patriarchalism. Locke agrees that some monarchies may have sprung from the father's authority over his family, or that several families may have given power to one man for military protection. Yet even if these theories are true, Locke says, early monarchs did not presume to rule by divine right. He believes most early monarchs were elected in some fashion. Power was placed in their hands so they could promote the public good and protect society. Locke envisions a bygone golden age when virtuous monarchs promoted the welfare of their subjects. Then things began to change.
Though the golden age, before vain ambition and evil concupiscence had corrupted men's minds into a mistake of true power and honor, had more virtue, and consequently better governors, as well as less vicious subjects, and there was then no stretching prerogative on the one side to oppress the people, nor consequently on the other any dispute about privilege to lessen or restrain the power of the magistrate, and so no contest betwixt rulers and people about governors or government. Yet, when ambition and luxury in future ages would retain and increase the power without doing the business for which it was given, and, aided by flattery, taught princes to have distinct and separate interests from their people, men found it necessary to examine more carefully the original and rights of government, and to find out ways to restrain the exorbitances, and prevent the abuses of that power, which they having entrusted in another's hands only for their own good, they found was made use of to hurt them.
Entrusted with the power to promote the public interest, some monarchs betrayed that trust and pursued their own interests instead. Locke's dubious excursion into history allowed him to point an accusing finger at England's Stuart kings without undermining the legitimacy of the English monarchy itself. Although Locke's history is seriously flawed, his theories about a state of nature and legitimate government are still valuable. For instance, as Locke points out, rulers of different countries are in a state of nature relative to each other.
'Tis often asked as a mighty objection, where are, or ever were there any men in such a state of nature? To which it may suffice as an answer at present, that since all princes and rulers of independent governments all through the world are in a state of nature, 'Tis plain the world never was, nor ever will be, without numbers of men in that state.
According to Locke, when a person consents to join a political society, he acquires a political obligation to obey the government of that society. But how can a government possibly obtain the consent of each and every person? Sir Robert Filmer raised this question in his attack on social contract theory. Obedience to a government, Filmer argued, can never rest on the unanimous consent of the governed. Even if an entire nation assembled at one time to vote on a government, only those people who voted for the government would be obligated to obey it. And what about those people who are born after a government is established? How does Locke deal with this problem of universal consent and political obligation? To understand his approach, we need to recall his distinction between two kinds of law, natural law and positive man-made law. Natural law, the law of God discovered through reason, is binding on all men in virtue of their rational natures. For example, you have a moral duty not to commit murder, and this duty doesn't require your consent. But the same is not true of positive laws, the man-made laws of political society authorized by a majority and enforced by government. The obligation to obey these laws derives from consent. For example, are you obligated to pay taxes to a government if you never consented to be ruled by that government? No, says Locke. You must first consent. Only then are you obligated to obey civil laws. Even if our ancestors consented to be ruled by a government, Locke argues, their decision cannot bind the current generation.
'Tis true that whatever engagements or promises anyone has made for himself, he is under the obligation of them, but cannot, by any compact whatsoever, bind his children or posterity. For this son, when a man, being altogether as free as the father, any act of the father can no more give away the liberty of the son than it can of anybody else.
Thus everyone must consent personally before he falls under the jurisdiction of a government. No sooner does Locke say this, however, than he resorts to a favorite ploy of social contract philosophers. Yes, he says, every person must consent, but this consent needn't be explicit. Political obligation can be created by tacit consent as well.
There is a common distinction of an express and tacit consent which will concern our present case. Nobody doubts but an express consent of any man entering into any society makes him a perfect member of that society, a subject of that government. The difficulty is what ought to be looked upon as a tacit consent, and how far it binds, that is, how far anyone shall be looked on to have consented, and thereby submitted to any government where he has made no expressions of it at all.
The word tacit means implied or understood without being put into words. Tacit consent is expressed in action rather than in words. How can our actions bind us to a government? Locke's answer is based on a government's jurisdiction over areas of land. If a foreigner travels through a country, he tacitly consents to obey the government of that country. Similarly, when a person inherits, buys, or uses land in any way, he tacitly agrees to obey the government which has legitimate jurisdiction over that land.
Whoever, by inheritance, purchase, permission, or other ways, enjoys any part of the land so annexed to and under the government of that commonwealth, must take it with the condition it is under, that is, of submitting to the government of that commonwealth under whose jurisdiction it is, as far forth as any subject of it.
This theory played an important role in early American history. After the Revolution, the American government faced the sticky problem of how it could obtain the consent and thereby the allegiance of every person within its jurisdiction. Locke's theory offered a solution. The government decreed that any person who voluntarily chose to reside in the United States had tacitly consented to become a citizen of the United States and to obey its laws. So far, Locke has discussed the state of nature, the state of war, the origin and justification of private property, and government by consent. The purpose of these theories is to show that legitimate governments exist for specific, well-defined purposes. We delegate some of our rights to government in the form of a trust. If a government violates this trust, if it abuses its power, then we can abolish it and institute new government. For Locke, therefore, a just government is a limited government. He spells out these limitations when he examines the legislative power of government. Locke regards the legislative, or law-making power, as the supreme governmental power in a commonwealth. In 17th century England, the king was part of this legislative branch. He had the power to summon and dissolve parliaments, and his consent was required for a bill to become law. Thus, when Locke talks about the legislative branch as sovereign, he does not mean to exclude the king. Locke restricts the supreme legislative power in a number of ways.
First, it is not, nor can possibly be, absolutely arbitrary over the lives and fortunes of the people. For it being but the joint power of every member of the society given up to that person or assembly which is legislator, it can be no more than those persons had in a state of nature before they entered into society and gave up to the community.
For Locke, remember, the individual has two basic rights, the specific right to preserve himself and the general right to preserve mankind. When individuals entrust these rights to a legislative power, they enable it to pass laws for the public good. Beyond this, however, the legislative may not go.
The legislative power is limited to the public good of the society. It is a power that hath no other end but preservation, and therefore can never have a right to destroy, enslave, or designedly to impoverish the subjects.
Locke formulates his second restraint on the legislative power as follows.
Secondly, the legislative, or supreme authority, cannot assume to itself a power to rule by extemporary, arbitrary decrees, but is bound to dispense justice and decide the rights of the subject by promulgated standing laws and known authorized judges.
Men join political society to become better off than they would be in a state of nature, not worse off.
It cannot be supposed that they should intend, had they a power so to do, to give to any one or more an absolute arbitrary power over their persons and estates, and put a force into the magistrate's hands to execute his unlimited will arbitrarily upon them. This were to put themselves into a worse condition than the state of nature.
Locke's third restraint on the legislative is designed to protect property.
Thirdly, the supreme power cannot take from any man any part of his property without his own consent. For the preservation of property being the end of government, and that for which men enter into society, it necessarily supposes and requires that the people should have property, without which they must be supposed to lose that by entering into society which was the end for which they entered into it. Too gross an absurdity for any man to own.
If a government may deprive us of property without our consent, this means in effect that we have no property at all.
I have truly no property in that which another can by right take from me when he pleases against my consent. Hence it is a mistake to think that the supreme or legislative power of any commonwealth can do what it will, and dispose of the estates of the subject arbitrarily, or take any part of them at pleasure.
A government, Locke concedes, requires money to operate, and it collects this money in the form of taxes. But all taxes must have the consent of the people.
'Tis true, governments cannot be supported without great charge, and 'tis fit everyone who enjoys his share of the protection should pay out of his estate his proportion for the maintenance of it. But still, it must be with his own consent. That is, the consent of the majority, giving it either by themselves or their representatives chosen by them.
Locke has specified 3 major limits on the power of government. When a government violates these limits consistently, it degenerates into despotism or tyranny, and may be forcibly resisted. Now we come to Locke's defense of revolution, contained in the final chapter of the second treatise. Entitled, Of the Dissolution of Government, this chapter opens with an important distinction.
He that will, with any clearness, speak of the dissolution of government ought, in the first place, to distinguish between the dissolution of the society and the dissolution of the government.
A political society, Locke says, is created by a social contract whereby people agree to abandon the state of nature and act as one body. This society then establishes a government, entrusting it with limited powers. A political society is distinct from its government. This is a radical theory, because it means a government can be overthrown without undermining the foundations of society. Revolution, in this view, need not bring social chaos in its wake. Nor does revolution throw society back into a state of nature. Revolutionaries are still bound by the social contract, even in the midst of their revolution. When we use words like revolution and rebellion to describe Locke's theory, we should keep something in mind. Locke doesn't care for these words, and as commentators have pointed out, he rarely uses them. At least, he rarely uses them to describe people who are seeking to reclaim their natural rights. As Locke sees the matter, when a government oppresses the people, it compels them to fight back. An oppressive government instigates rebellion. An oppressive government is the true rebel because it rebels against its proper limits.
Rebellion, being an opposition, not to persons, but authority, which is founded only in the constitutions and laws of the government, those, whoever they may be, who by force break through, and by force justify their violation of them, are truly and properly rebels. For when men, by entering into society and civil government, have excluded force, and introduced laws for the preservation of property, peace, and unity amongst themselves, those who set up force again in opposition to the laws do rebellare, that is, bring back again the state of war, and are properly rebels.
For Locke, the chief rebels are kings who abuse their power. These tyrannical kings, and not the people they oppress, are responsible for the dissolution of governments. Locke mentions 5 ways a king can dissolve a government. First, a king can set up his arbitrary will in place of the laws. Second, a king can interfere with the proper functions of the legislative branch. Third, a king can manipulate elections to place his cronies in office. Fourth, a king can sell out his country to a foreign power. And fifth, a king can fail to execute the law of the land. These are the crimes of kings, but the legislative branch can dissolve governments as well.
The legislative acts against the trust reposed in them, when they endeavor to invade the property of the subject, and to make themselves or any part of the community masters or arbitrary disposers of the lives, liberties, or fortunes of the people.
When the king or the legislative betray their trust and dissolve a government, the people may replace them.
By this breach of trust, they forfeit the power the people had put into their hands for quite contrary ends, and it devolves to the people, who have a right to resume their original liberty, and, by the establishment of a new legislative, such as they shall think fit, provide for their own safety and security, which is the end for which they are in society.
The people, Locke says, always retain the right to overthrow an unjust government.
For the society can never, by the fault of another, lose the native and original right it has to preserve itself, which can only be done by a settled legislative and a fair and impartial execution of the laws made by it. But the state of mankind is not so miserable that they are not capable of using this remedy till it be too late to look for any.
Locke, like all defenders of revolution, had to answer a serious objection. If we admit the right of revolution, who is to say precisely when a revolution becomes necessary. Before Locke's time, French, Dutch, and English philosophers had defended the right of revolution, but they often qualified this right. They believed, for example, that revolution against a king could be initiated only by nobles or by a parliament. These theorists studiously avoided placing the right of revolution in the hands of the people. Locke's theory is far more radical. He was not about to locate the right of revolution in Parliament, because he knew the legislative branch could be as tyrannical as any king. Instead, Locke offers the right of revolution as a natural right, possessed by the people at large.
The people shall be judge. For who shall be judge whether his trustee or deputy acts well and according to the trust reposed in him, but he who deputes him, and must, by having deputed him, have still a power to discard him when he fails in his trust.
When a government becomes oppressive, it enters into a state of war against the people. Who is to say exactly when this happens?
Every man is to judge for himself, as in all other cases, so in this, whether another hath put himself into a state of war with him.
When the rulers and the ruled are thrown into a violent state of war, no earthly power can adjudicate their dispute.
Force between either persons, who have no known superior on earth, or which permits no appeal to a judge on earth, being properly a state of war, wherein the appeal lies only to heaven, and in that state the injured party must judge for himself, when he will think fit to make use of that appeal, and put himself upon it.
Won't this lead to frequent rebellions by unruly mobs? No, says Locke. If anything, the people tend to be patient and long-suffering in the face of oppression. Only when a government persists in flagrant oppression do the people finally rise up.
If a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices, all tending the same way, make the design visible to the people, and they cannot but feel what they lie under, and see whither they are going, 'tis not to be wondered that they should then rouse themselves, and endeavour to put the rule into such hands which may secure to them the ends for which government was first erected.
Even if the people's right of revolution does lead to violence and civil war, the real culprits are the oppressors, not the oppressed.
If any mischief come in such cases, it is not to be charged upon him who defends his own right, but on him that invades his neighbours. If the innocent, honest man must quietly quit all he has for peace' sake, to him who will lay violent hands upon it, I desire it may be considered what a kind of peace there will be in the world, which consists only in violence and rapine, and which is to be maintained only for the benefit of robbers and oppressors. Who would not think it an admirable peace betwixt the mighty and the mean, when the lamb, without resistance, yielded his throat to be torn by the imperious wolf?
We hope you've enjoyed this presentation of Two Treatises of Government by Knowledge Products. The script for Two Treatises of Government is by George H. Smith. Script editing is by Wendy McElroy. The producer is Pat Childs. Narration is by Craig Deichman. Vocal characterizations are by Pat Childs, Dan Church, Travis Hardison, Paul Meyer, and Sam Mercurio. Music by Ralph Childs. Recorded at Archer Productions. This material may not be copied in whole or in part without the written permission of the copyright owner. Copyright 1987 by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated.